with like understanding, do I sit here and talk a lot about different components and so on and so forth and over articulate it, or do I just keep it simple? I'm going to give you guys the information, and hopefully the way that I explain it is simplistic enough for you to put it into your own understanding, for you to comprehend, and then to put into practice and into your development or someone else's development. Okay, so we're going to start with the loading pattern and the quad dominant versus hip hinge. Okay, so a couple different things you got to take into consideration is that there's an anatomical structure restriction for a lot of guys that we tell them to move a certain way, but it does not guarantee that they are going to move that particular way. There's a lot of things that go into it that I'll include in the ebook to truly break it down. But the more that I've researched and the more that I've kind of just observed, I think the less importance that I put on just the underlying notion that one of the drive leg loading patterns, whether it be quad dominant or hip hinging, is more dominant or is more superior than the other. When I first started getting into doing analysis and mechanical work, it was always about optimizing your drive leg loading pattern to fit more of a hip hinging style, right? Hinging at the hips. Why? Because to be able to efficiently absorb energy, right, like we talked about earlier, to efficiently be able to absorb that energy and to stabilize that, it makes more sense to utilize and incorporate our biggest muscle group in our glutes. And in order to do that, when we descend from our leg lift, if we hip hinge and we hinge, now we're activating glute rather than the opposite, which would be the quad dominant, whereas we don't really necessarily get our glutes much involved. So then we are isolating our quads to stabilize and absorb that energy. Now, like I said, I don't look at it so much anymore as one is superior than the other. It always comes down to the athlete. And that's why it can get over complex, because there's not really just a set answer. I think it would make a lot more sense for me to just be like, hey, no, do this loading pattern and that's it. I've seen multiple occasions, myself included, that just cannot move a particular way, whether it be doing a hip hinge in your delivery or quad dominant, whatever it may be. It always comes down to the individual. And what do I mean by that? Looking at particular breakdowns within the individual's delivery and determining where we need to spend our time now with our development. Meaning, if this particular guy is a quad dominant loader where he loads his drive leg and that knee cracks over his foot, if he's struggling with a couple different components in regards to a collapse of his drive leg because he's quad dominant, so then he's not able to fully absorb a lot of that energy, because again, when the force is greater than the capacity, that's when you're going to see a breakdown. And one of the bigger breakdowns we see in the drive leg mechanics is when that drive leg collapses early because it can't handle and absorb all of that force. So that's one particular component that we look at and say, okay, we got to incorporate or we got to utilize your glutes. We got to get you more into a hip hinge to effectively absorb and stabilize that energy, because you're obviously not being able to do it through quad dominance. Another component with quad dominance that we see oftentimes with guys is that's going to throw off their direction. Again, direction is mostly dictated by their drive leg, in my opinion. So if the direction is going into that form of that quad dominant where that knee cracks over the foot, now what we see is instead of this going towards our target, this goes this way. Now your entire direction is thrown off, and then in order to compensate, that's where we really look at that move to determine if that's an inefficient movement or not. If the compensation is to initiate your trunk rotation early to pull to get back online, then we need to fix that, right? Because we don't want to initiate early trunk rotation. We don't want to throw off alignment. For me, and I'm not saying this because I believe I'm superior in any way, but my compensation is not to the point where it's so extreme that it's affecting my trunk rotation mechanics, right? So you'll see me when I pitch, my knee cracks over my front foot, but I'm still able to keep my pelvis neutral throughout the entirety of my drive phase, which also allows me to keep my trunk neutral, and then boom. Another factor with the quad dominant is that you guys can see through a lot of the mechanical screenings that I've done is that not only is it a misdirection, but it can limit the amount of hip shoulder separation that you get. And now I say this all the time, like hip shoulder separation accounts for 80% of our velocity, which is probably the biggest domino. So we want to make sure that we don't mess that component up, right? Like that's the component we don't mess up. So again, going back to the individual per individual basis, if we see someone that is loading in more of a quad dominant fashion, and they're able to absorb force and stabilize, right? That's not the component. Their drive leg is not collapsing, it's staying stable. But if they go to this way, okay, and then their trunk starts to go with it, and they don't create that amount of separation through being on line with their hip rotation, right? Because if you're quad dominant, your knee goes this way, then you're also going to have to initiate that rotation a lot earlier because you have more space to cover. Whereas if you were hinging at the hips and your knee was going straight to the catcher, then you obviously don't have as much space and you can initiate hip rotation on time. Now again, I know that there's a lot to digest here, but it's going to go off per individual basis, and determining if one of the particular loading patterns is causing more issues downstream. So I believe when it comes to the overall importance and what we should look at in terms of the drive leg loading pattern, let's just put this up here so I have it, is, okay, so we have the quad dominant and the hip hinging, and we want to look at, can the athlete absorb and stabilize that incoming energy from peak leg lift, right? Because we see over and over again, a collapse of the drive leg initiates an early energy transfer, and it leaves a lot of potential power output on the table. So we want to make sure for certain, can the athlete stabilize force and store force in the drive leg? Now, that's going to allow us to kind of get an indication on where we need to modify as far as how we load the drive leg. That's number one. I would say number two is the direction, right? I talked about how when you are loading your drive leg quad dominant, that's going to throw off your direction a little bit. Now, I always talk about how compensation is kind of a negative terminology, but not all compensations are bad. A compensation to compensate your drive leg loading pattern of quad dominant could also be something that helps you out, right? So that's something to look at per individual basis. I'll try to include as many screens as I possibly can to give you as much context. And then we would look at the last component in regards to heel disconnection. I'll link up a video as well talking about don't overthink heel connection and disconnection, all this stuff. But heel disconnection, we can use the heel as an indicator of, are we leaking early? Are we leaving early? Are we disconnecting from the ground early? Or are we rotating at the time that we should be rotating? Basically, when I look at heel disconnection, the heel should disconnect when the pelvis starts to initiate its rotation, or the rear hip starts to internally rotate. Okay, now if that's going to be going early because of your quad dominant loading pattern taking you into a misdirection, then you're limiting your amount of ground force production that you can have through the entirety of the drive phase, and we would need to look at that on a per individual basis to determine, like, is this one of the things that is your lowest hanging fruit that we need to attack, right? Okay,